Picture a man who has spent his entire adult life standing inside the brightest spotlight that British entertainment has ever produced. Every television appearance carefully rehearsed. Every public smile precisely calibrated. Every single word spoken to a journalist filtered through decades of quiet, practiced discipline. The fans who have followed him since the 1950s believe they know him completely. They have watched him age without ever seeming to age. They have listened to his voice fill stadiums that other artists could only dream of filling. They have defended him in conversations, named their children after his songs, and wept at his concerts in ways they cannot fully explain even now. And yet the man standing inside all of that adoration has been quietly carrying something for 29 consecutive years that none of those devoted, loyal, loving people ever knew existed. Not his closest colleagues. Not his longest friendships. Not even the doctors who examined him regularly. Nobody. When the truth finally came forward, it did not arrive with drama or a carefully managed press release. It arrived in the middle of a quiet and deeply human conversation between two men, one of whom was facing his own mortality at the very same moment. And what Sir Cliff Richard said in that conversation did not just shock the people watching. It fundamentally reframed every assumption the public had ever held about the life he had been privately living behind the image they thought they understood so perfectly. To truly understand what he finally revealed and why keeping it hidden for 29 years is more unsettling than it first appears, you have to go back to the very beginning. Because the story of Sir Cliff Richard is not the story most people think they have been following all along. He was not born with that name. He came into the world as Harry Roger Webb on the 14th of October, 1940, in the northern Indian city of Lucknow. His father worked for the Indian Railways. His mother ran their household with warmth and quiet determination. Harry grew up with 3 sisters in a home that felt genuinely safe against the backdrop of a country being torn apart by the violent convulsions of independence. That safety did not last. In 1948, the family made the painful and permanent decision to leave India altogether and begin again in England. The ship journey took 3 weeks. The adjustment to gray, cold, unfamiliar England took considerably longer and hit the young Harry far harder than he ever allowed the public to understand in later years. They settled in Hertford. Harry went to school, applied himself reasonably, and eventually found himself working as a filing clerk in an office, sorting papers with his hands while his mind was always somewhere else entirely. Music arrived in his life the way the best things always do, suddenly, and with the force of something that could not be undone. His father purchased a guitar for him when he was 16, and it was immediately clear that Harry Webb had found the one language he had been searching for without knowing it. He threw himself into the skiffle craze sweeping through every school and youth club in the country, formed bands wherever anyone would tolerate the noise, and quickly arrived at the conclusion that the name Harry Webb was never going to carry the weight of what he intended to become. A man named Harry Greatorex suggested the name Cliff in 1958, arguing it had solidity and force to it. The surname Richard came from Cliff himself, borrowed and rearranged from elsewhere. A new identity was assembled from scratch, and it fit so well that the original version of the man almost disappeared entirely inside it. His first recording session was supposed to produce a gentle, forgettable track called Schoolboy Crush. But the song that changed everything was hiding on the other side of that session. Move It was raw and swaggering and electric in a way that the British charts had never quite experienced before. It reached number 2 immediately. The newspapers called him the British Elvis, and the description was not entirely wrong. He had the movement, the magnetism, and the particular kind of danger that made parents deeply uncomfortable and their children absolutely frantic. The band he performed with eventually became the Shadows. The trajectory he was on had become impossible to stop. Then in 1964, something happened that divided everything in his life cleanly into before and after. Cliff Richard gave his life to the Christian faith in a way that was total and immediate and entirely genuine. It was not a publicity maneuver or a careful repositioning. He seriously considered abandoning pop music completely and retraining as a school teacher because he could not see how faith and fame could possibly coexist inside the same human life. The people around him convinced him otherwise. And in 1966, he stood on a stage alongside the American preacher Billy Graham and announced his beliefs openly to an audience of millions. It was the kind of declaration that ends careers. Somehow, it did not end his. Instead, it became the foundation of an identity so singular that no other British pop star has ever successfully occupied the same space before or since. He kept singing across decades that swallowed his contemporaries whole. He came agonizingly close to winning Eurovision in 1968 with Congratulations, losing by a single point in circumstances that felt suspicious to almost everyone watching. He made films that became genuinely beloved parts of British cultural memory. He received his knighthood in 1995, becoming the first rock and roll performer in British history to be honored in that way. On the surface, the story was one of relentless, almost impossible triumph. Underneath the surface, a very different and considerably more complicated story had been running quietly in parallel all along. The question that every journalist who ever sat across from Sir Cliff Richard eventually arrived at was always the same. Why had he never married? The man was charming, wealthy, famous, and by every available account, genuinely kind. The answer he always provided was polished and ready. His career was the great love of his life. The stage was his true home. But the fuller and more honest answer is considerably more uncomfortable than that, because Cliff Richard did not remain unmarried because he never met anyone worth marrying. He remained unmarried because he actively, deliberately, and repeatedly chose something else over the women who entered his life. There was a young dancer named Delia Wicks who met him at the London Palladium in the early 1960s. She was 20 years old, and Cliff was genuinely taken with her from the beginning. But as his feelings for her deepened, the arithmetic of fame made itself felt. He wrote her a letter ending the relationship. The letter was not cruel in its language, but what it represented was a man consciously placing his career above another person's heart without apparent hesitation. Delia was devastated in ways that stayed with her for a very long time afterward. Then there was Jackie Irving, a 19-year-old dancer he spent a warm and close summer with in Blackpool. The connection between them was real, and the happiness of that period was not manufactured. But Cliff walked into his manager's office and asked an explicit and revealing question. If he married Jackie, how many fans would he lose? The answer came back, approximately 1/3 of his entire audience. He ended the relationship the same day. He later recounted this episode publicly in a television interview with Piers Morgan, who was visibly unsettled by what he was hearing. Morgan used the word ruthless. He asked directly how any person could apply that kind of cold calculation to their own romantic life. Cliff's defense was that if a love had truly been the kind that overwhelms everything else, no figure quoted by a manager would have stopped him. Perhaps that is true. But what remains when you look at the pattern honestly is a man who consistently arrived at the same answer whenever the question was forced. Fame over everything else. The Sue Barker chapter of his private life revealed a different and arguably more troubling dimension of the same pattern. Sue was a celebrated tennis champion and television presenter when Cliff pursued her in the 1980s, tracking down her number and inviting her to a concert with a quiet confidence of someone who rarely hears no. They spent a genuinely enjoyable period together, exchanged warm communications, and were photographed frequently enough to cement the public impression of a real romance. But things cooled. The manner in which the ending was communicated to Sue reportedly involved Cliff sending a third party to make the call rather than speaking directly to her himself. What followed was worse than the ending. For years, stretching into decades, Cliff continued telling interviewers that he had seriously contemplated proposing to Sue, but had ultimately decided he was not quite in love enough to go through with it. Sue, who had long since built a genuinely happy life of her own, eventually addressed this in print with undisguised anger. She wrote clearly that had she known a few casual months of socializing would still be cited in public interviews 40 years into the future, she would never have spent any time with him at all. She felt the entire thing had been exaggerated and reframed in a way that served his narrative at the direct expense of her own privacy and dignity. And this is where the disturbance in the story begins to take its real shape. Because it was not just the romantic relationships. For the better part of 3 decades, Cliff Richard shared his living arrangements with his longtime manager Bill Latham and Bill's family, creating a private domestic life that bore no resemblance to the bachelor existence his public persona suggested. The arrangement was entirely his own business, but the secrecy around it, the careful refusal to ever address what his actual private life looked like, meant that the vacuum his silence created was inevitably filled with speculation, persistent rumor, and in certain quarters, something actively cruel. He consistently and calmly denied the persistent suggestion that he was gay, pointing out with measured patience that a man who chose not to pursue every available woman was not thereby revealing anything private about his own nature. He refused to marry purely for the sake of quieting gossip, calling that option dishonest in a way that offended his deeply held convictions. He made his peace, he said, with the reality that people would always believe whatever they had decided to believe regardless of what he said or did. Then in 2014, everything he had built across 6 decades came under a threat of a different and far more dangerous kind entirely. A serious criminal allegation was made against him, claiming a sexual offense against a 15-year-old at a religious event in Sheffield in 1985. 4 additional allegations followed from separate individuals, spanning different decades of his career. The Crown Prosecution Service opened a formal investigation. What happened next became one of the most discussed and debated moments in the history of British media ethics. Police executed a search of his private home. The BBC, having been tipped off in advance, filmed and broadcast that search live on national television. Cliff Richard was not present. He watched footage of his own property being gone through by investigators on the evening news in exactly the same way any member of the public would have watched it. He had not been arrested. He had not been charged. He had not even been formally spoken to at that point. Every single allegation was eventually dropped. The prosecuting authorities concluded there was insufficient credible evidence to support any of the claims. He was entirely cleared. But the experience of watching his home searched on live television before he had been accused of anything formally, before he had been given any opportunity to respond, left wounds that no legal vindication could properly close. He described lying awake at night, consumed by a darkness toward his unnamed accuser that frightened him when he examined it honestly. The physical toll was severe. He developed shingles so acute that the blisters reached toward his eyes, and his doctor warned him he was in genuine danger of losing his sight permanently. He took the BBC to court and won, securing a legal ruling that contributed meaningfully to how people accused of serious crimes are represented in media before charges are ever formally brought. He has not stopped advocating for that cause since the day the cameras finally left his street. And then came the secret that had been carried for 29 years. In a conversation with former broadcaster Dermot Murnaghan, who was himself publicly confronting a stage for cancer diagnosis at the time, Sir Cliff Richard disclosed for the first time that he had been quietly managing early-stage prostate cancer entirely alone. He was 84 years old when he said it out loud. The cancer had been discovered accidentally during a routine insurance medical ahead of his planned 2024 Australian and New Zealand tour. His doctors had found it in time. Treatment had been successful. He had come through it. But throughout the entire period of diagnosis, testing, and treatment, he had not told a single person in his life what was happening inside his body. He had kept performing, kept planning, kept presenting the version of himself that the public recognized, while living privately inside a fear that most people would have found impossible to contain. He did not describe the secret as strength when he finally broke it open. He described it as a habit, the habit of managing everything internally, of presenting the composed exterior while the interior ran whatever it needed to run without an audience. He said plainly that men carry a particular and dangerous tendency to believe they are built differently from their own fragility, and that this belief costs some of them their lives. He urged every man listening to be tested without delay. He spoke of King Charles, who had recently spoken publicly about his own cancer experience, and said he was prepared to stand beside him in any campaign for a national prostate cancer screening program, with whatever energy and platform he had remaining. And that is where the disturbance in this story finally reveals its deepest layer. Because the secret was not salacious. It was not the dark or dishonest thing that the whispers across those 29 years had always implied might eventually emerge. It was a man with a habit of complete self-containment, carried so long and practiced so consistently that even a cancer diagnosis could not break it immediately. A man who had spent his whole life giving his audience everything and keeping everything else entirely to himself. The romances ended quietly. The domestic arrangements managed without explanation. The rumors absorbed without counterattack. The false accusations survived without collapse. And then a tumor discovered in silence, carried in silence, treated in silence, and only released when sitting across from another man who was himself confronting the fragility of his own body in real time. He has given quietly to charitable causes across his entire career without ever manufacturing publicity around it. He traveled personally to Uganda and Brazil. He raised funds for the hospital that kept his tiny nephew Philip alive through the first 4 terrifying months of a child's life. He spent years championing Alzheimer's research after watching his mother disappear slowly into that disease. He built a tennis foundation that has put more than 200,000 children onto courts across the country. The double life of Sir Cliff Richard was not built on anything corrupt, but it was built on something genuinely unsettling when you hold it in the light long enough. It was built on the absolute, practiced, lifelong conviction that the only version of himself the world was entitled to see was the performing version. That everything behind that version, the loneliness, the fear, the illness, the nights lying awake, full of feelings he was frightened by, belonged entirely to him alone and would be shared with nobody. For 29 years, a man stood on stages and gave millions of people everything they came for while quietly managing something that could have killed him without a single one of them ever knowing it had existed. That is the truth that finally came out. And now that it is in the open, it raises a question that sits uncomfortably with everyone who has ever loved what he gave them from that stage. What does it cost a person to perform that kind of composure for a lifetime? And what would it have meant for him and for the men who watched and stayed quiet about their own bodies if he had not waited quite so long to say it out loud?